Welcome back to our State of the Nation address, and joining us in a studio this morning, Marcus Egenga, of course, who was with us for our newspaper review segment, and Dismas Mukua, political commentator, also joins us as we take a look at the Senate this morning. And of course, gentlemen, all eyes are on the Senate this morning. This is the make or break decision that will either raise political temperatures or, decide the way forward in the elections. Dismas, are you satisfied with the public submissions that were given to the Senate Legal Affairs Committee?
Well, maybe we begin from where we started, the rain started beating us. CORD indicated that they were unhappy with the operations of the IBC, and they wanted some changes. And they agreed that changing this law would be through consensus. Right. And you saw all the shenanigans, people going to the streets, a lot of demonstrations. In fact, a number of people died. And the principals from Jubilee and CORD agreed to have a negotiation. And this law was to come through consensus. And they agreed. When the bill was presented to the National Assembly and Senate, everybody was in agreement that we are not going to change a comma, we are not going to change a full stop. It goes as it is. And MPs, as it's normal with them, they just behaved like mere rubber stamps. So they passed the legislation. So when now you want to amend a constitution, which has been occasioned by consensus, then again you must use consensus to do the negotiation. So it's very disappointing that the Speaker of the National Assembly, Honorable Muturi, allowed for that kind of madness to take place through the Senate, or rather through the National Assembly. It's actually unacceptable, it's even bad manners, that the Speaker of the National Assembly would push through that piece of legislation with the help of the majority leader. And for the first time since all of us have been around in Kenya, nobody has been in a position to see a lot of police presence in the National Assembly. It's as if you're in a police state, and people were not allowed to debate. There was mischief. There was Emilio Diambo and a number of MPs. Right. And what was very disappointing, because I paid close attention, is that the Speaker of the National Assembly was escorted to the chambers by armed policemen. Right. That's something you would expect when you're transporting money using Wells Fargo, not when the Speaker of the National Assembly is going to the Senate. So, number one, the Speaker of the National Assembly did a mistake by failing to allow for public participation. Because this law is not being made for the members of the National Assembly or Jubilee or CORD. It's a law being made for 45 million Kenyans. So coming to the Senate, you begin to see elements of wisdom in what Ekwe Ethuro is doing. And he has said that we are going to allow public participation. Now, the germane issue here is that we need to engage in a bit of electronic voting, which again is a misnomer. Because really, there are three elements of the electronic aspect. People complain that in the past, dead people would go and cast the ballots. So for CORD, who claim they've lost 2 elections because of dead voters, they want that it's an actual human being who goes to the polling station, who is identified. So you can do this using your fingerprint, using your retina, and all these things they refer to as body geometry, whatever that means. That you must be a live human being going to the polling station, you cast your ballot, and while you're casting your ballot, there's an automatic transfer that, in fact, a certain ballot has been removed from the system. So at the end of the day, you are able to look at the number of ballots which have been removed and the number of ballots in the ballot boxes, and then you come up with an accurate figure. So really here, the bone of contention is whether or not we are going to allow dead voters to go and cast their ballots. And it was a very interesting submission made by Governor Isaac Ruto, who says, because what Jubilee is proposing, that let's go to a manual system, and if the party agents and the electoral officers are agreed that, in fact, this is Dismas Mukua, if I don't have my fingerprints or my retina, those officials would agree this is a good human being, allow him to vote. But what happens if it's Mr. Kenyatta running as a presidential candidate for Jubilee, and he doesn't have a representative in, say, Bondo, where Raila comes from? Because it's unlikely that Kenyatta will have a representative in Bondo, or Raila or Musalia Mudavadi or Wetangula will have a representative in Ishaweri. What happens? People will just agree. And that's why you see in some parts of Kenya, both CORD areas and Jubilee, there is more often than not 100% voter turnout. And it can never happen in any democracy. Because if you register, say, 10,000 people at a polling station, there's a chance that within 5 years, a number of people have died. Some people will not be happy to go and cast the ballot. So really, it's unlikely that you can have 100% voter turnout. And that one has been witnessed in the elections in 2007 and 13. So we need to give Equator a pat on the back for at least allowing for public participation. And when I saw the submissions, they were very interesting and at some stage amusing. The most amusing bit came from the ICT cabinet secretary, who indicated, and you see, if you look at his background, Mr. Musheru is said to have made a fortune from investing in ICTs. And he's worked for Google, a company that majority of Kenyans would like to work for, which places a huge premium on technology.
Right.
But he comes and he says, wait a minute, this system is likely to fail, that we don't have mobile phone coverage the entire nation. And even for an engineering student, just going into an engineering class, he knows that you can use satellite phones. Yeah, you can use satellite phones. And in fact, SK Macharia indicated that during 2007, they were able to cover the entire nation using satellite phones. So some of these reasons are really giving logic upside down. It was even more confusing when the Attorney General himself, who is a professor of law, indicated that the electronic systems all over the world are designed to fail. So you're beginning to wonder, Jubilee is a digital government. Everything is going to digital. We are told that actually by the beginning of this year, all schools in Kenya should be connected to the power grid.
Right.
If you want a driving license, everything is online.
Citizen, everything is absolutely.
So how come when it comes to a basic thing like voting, you have to go to a manual system? And you know, voting, Michelle, it's not a complicated neurosurgeon that you need to bring together a bunch of highly qualified doctors. It's very simple. You get your ballot, you cast it in the ballot box, and you go home. So for me, I really don't know why these politicians are keeping us static. Instead, you know, at this stage, we are not supposed to be discussing how we are going to cast our ballots. We are supposed to be auditing Jubilee. Have they done a good job at the national level? We are supposed to be auditing CORD, where we have CORD governors. Have they done a good job? But because they want to take, they want to frustrate Wanjiku's efforts, instead of us discussing their manifestos at a national and a county level, here we are discussing the mechanics of going to cast the ballot, which is really unacceptable because at the end of the day, Wanjiku is suffering.
All right, let's hear from you, Marcus, and let's begin from where Dismas began. You know, are we talking about Ekwe Ethuro being the voice of reason, considering Justin Muturi did not include public participation in this process?
I share the same sentiments as him, that the Speaker of the Senate exuded a lot of wisdom and confidence. And for the first time in Kenya's political history, we saw soberness prevail and partisan considerations put aside. And I think he allowed, because part of our values as a democracy is public participation. And that's what he allowed. And also, to stress what he said earlier on, is that we must understand where we were coming from and how we got where we are. That CORD's resistance and call for reforms in the electoral management body and consequently on the laws that govern our elections, they called for reforms which were not adhered to. Then they went to the streets. A number of people died, and therefore there was need to have a parliamentary select committee to discuss the issues that were being raised, and an agreement was reached at. So the problem, in my view, even as elections observation group, our problem is not so much about the content of the law, but the manner in which the things are being done. That when you have a product of consensus, when you have a product that has come about as a result of public participation, for you to be able to change that product, then you must resort to what brought it into existence. And that is what ELOG has been advocating for. That, look, gentlemen and ladies, involve the stakeholders. Because elections are about the people, Michelle. Elections are about the people. And the process, or the processes in elections must be fair, they must be transparent, they must be accountable. And so that the people should own the process. If they don't own the process, then, and they're not being included into the process, then they will disown the process. And if they disown the process, then what you'll be asking for are chaos. And so I agree that we must hail the Speaker of the Senate and also of the Senate themselves because of the manner in which they conduct themselves.
Right.
Yes.
But there's also, even as we look back on this entire process, this must brought in the question of what did the police have to do with anything when these amendments were being introduced? And the question, even the speaker asked, who deployed the police here? Do you think this must, that was a move? Could we say that the executive sort of attacked the legislature there?
Yeah, again, when you look at our constitution, they say the power in Kenya is a sovereign. It lies with Wanjiku. And it's delegated to three arms of the government. That's the executive, legislature, as well as the judiciary. And all those three arms are supposed to operate in an independent manner. And independent in both at an institutional level and at an individual level. There are, like for instance, if it's at the judiciary, that's where you have the Judicial Service Commission, which is independent, drawing its money directly from the treasury, and the judges are supposed to make their own decisions when they're making their rulings. Nobody expects that a judge is going to receive a phone call to make a ruling in any way. The same is supposed to be the case for the National Assembly and the Senate. They've got a Parliamentary Service Commission, which draws its resources from the Treasury direct. In the former years, the National Assembly was part of the Office of the President, so they did not have any sort of independence. But now they've got their own resources. They don't need to go to the cabinet to cry for resources. As soon as they make their presentations to the Treasury, it all becomes a mechanical process. And it's a tragedy that the Speaker of the National Assembly would actually allow proceedings to go on while there are policemen outside with tear gases, with all manner of weapons. And some of the members made it very clear that we've come here to have a conversation, to engage in intellectual conversations. We've not come here to throw stones.
And it doesn't look like a democratic state at all when there's police outside Parliament during a sitting.
Yeah, and again, in any event, assuming that you are going to have some rowdy MPs, there is the sergeant at arms within the National Assembly. And now the contradiction between Honorable Muturi and Honorable Ekwethuro, when the members of the Senate attracted the Speaker of the attention of Ekwethuro that we have policemen outside, he actually demanded to know who summoned them. And in a matter of seconds, Honorable Haji indicated that they've been withdrawn. And Honorable Haji was playing mischief by saying, now it's been withdrawn, the matter is done and, done and dusted. But Ekwethuro said, no. You must do investigations for us to establish who, in fact, authorized the policemen to come outside here. And when I speak to a number of my friends at the National Assembly, they said this was just meant to intimidate them. Because, you are required to park your vehicle as far as the Holy Family Basilica or, some funny highway and then walk to the National Assembly. So you're being reminded that when you are a member of the National Assembly, there's a stronger power somewhere which is dictating this. And if you notice, a day before, the Deputy President, Mr. Ruto, indicated on a television interview that tomorrow these laws are going to be passed. So you begin to wonder, the members of Jubilee in the National Assembly, do they actually act on their own motion or they follow instructions from elsewhere? Assuming that if you're a member of the National Assembly from Jubilee, you are held captive and you're supposed to be loyal to your party leader. But what happens to Muturi? Isn't Muturi supposed to allow sober conversations to go on? Isn't Laboso supposed to allow sober conversations to go on? And there's this myth we have among our members of the National Assembly, the Senate, and even the county assemblies, that the moment you get elected, the moment you win an election, now all of a sudden you've got the IQ of Albert Einstein and you can only listen to yourself.
Right.
They should have allowed for consensus. They should have allowed for conversations. And even for the speaker to do a special gazette notice in the middle of the night, it's really unacceptable. And Kenya is a constitutional democracy.
Right.
And if all factors were held constant, Senator, or rather Mr. Muturi, should actually be at home. Because he has actually abused the constitution we got 2010, which gives him unlimited powers to run the National Assembly, guided and loyal to the constitution. But it seems to me at this stage that Mr. Muturi is not loyal to the constitution, is not loyal to the standing orders, but is loyal to Jubilee as a political party. And the SCJN has indicated those amendments, they're very solid. In fact, there's nothing wrong really with them.
Right.
There's nothing wrong in suggesting a manual backup, provided the manual backup, which is being seen as option or plan B, does not actually become the plan A. Because, we live in Kenya and we know that as we approach the elections, There are people who want to maintain the status quo. They would ensure that the electronic system fails so that you go back to the manual.
But we have the likes of Attorney General Githu Muigai, who says what we used in the previous general election was actually a manual system only supported by the electronic system. And so he says Kenyans don't quite understand the debate that's going on. We used a manual system last time.
Professor Githu Muigai is a professor of law and he's a lawyer. He's representing his client at this stage. And the client is executive. So for him, he'll play around with words. When you look whether it's a manual backed by electronic backed by manual, that's an issue of semantics. Again, anybody with a basic understanding of English will know what you're talking about. There are three components that are code and the Jubilee have to agree on. That when you go to the polling station, number one, the register must be cleaned. That you're going to be identified using your fingerprints or your retina or some unique aspect of your body. That's the first part, which is supposed to be electronic. The reason why that needs to happen is to ensure that you don't have dead voters. And you have dead voters both in code areas as well as Jubilee areas who rise up votes. Miracles keep on happening in Kenya, resurrection, and then they go back. Then the second one is tallying. And then the third one is transmission. So those are the three aspects. So whether you say it's a manual backed by electronic backed by manual, that's an issue of semantics. And Professor Githu Muigai, a top lawyer, I suspect before he went to the Senate, he had a conversation with his principal, or rather with his clients, and they agreed on the do's and don'ts.
Right.
I would imagine if Githu was, or rather, if it was CORD that had proposed that let's have a manual backup, Professor Githu Muigai would have a very convincing argument on the other side.
Right. And even as before we get to the Senate to vote and how they may vote and the outcome of that, Marcus, being from the elections observations group, there are many who say that this process, whether it's manual or electronic, is just a very small fraction of the electoral process. What more do Kenyans need to focus on that is not yet in order before the elections?
Elections are, and I think Githu Muigai yesterday, I think the day before yesterday, he said something that is very true, that elections are not an event, it is a process. So we, as elections observation group, we see elections as in form of a cycle. A number of activities must be put in place because one of them is the electoral legal framework of a country. That is where we are at this point.
Right.
Then we also need to speak about voter education. Because if you remember last time, a number of stakeholders decried the manner in which we had spoiled votes. The other thing that we need to speak about in the electoral cycle is the issue of campaign. The issue of the inclusion of special interest groups in the electoral process. How are the women participating? How are the youth participating? How are the elderly people participating in the process? Because electoral process must be inclusive. Then the other issues in terms of procurement of electoral materials. How are they going to be procured? And if you see some of the changes that IEBC has proposed, which was adopted by the National Assembly, is to have the procurement done 120 days before an election, rather than the 8 months that the law had envisioned.
And as you speak, there's already talk that it's a bit too late to buy this now.
Yeah, that's what they're saying. And there are suggestions of how that can be helped. So you have the question of apart from voter education, there's also the question of civic education that also comes in as a part of the larger process of elections. So right now we are focusing on one aspect, not little, but really a major aspect of the electoral process, because the electoral legal framework provides the rules of engagement. Because without it, then it becomes chaotic.
Right.
So we are engaging in a very critical aspect of our process, but not the only process that is there. Now, very briefly, for a minute or so, to get back to whether it's the manual or electronic system. Again, from observers' point of view, the process must be owned by the people, because again, elections are about the people. Whichever process Kenya adopts, ILOG takes the opinion that it must be inclusive. If you want to do manual system, please involve the stakeholders. The government is saying that the equipment are bound to fail. The opposition, and then again the other day from the ICT
Cabinet Secretary,
he said that we are likely to be, that the equipment are likely to be
to fail as well.
Attacked by Al-Shabaab.
Al-Shabaab, isn't it? Huh?
Right.
So whichever the reasons for not relying on electronic system entirely, the court is saying, oh, Jubilee, they want to rig elections using a manual system. But the truth of the matter is this, from an observer's point of view, manual system is prone to manipulation. It's the truth all over the world.
But so is the electronic
yes,
system.
exactly. Yeah. So whichever, there are genuine reasons. There are genuine reasons to doubt reliability on one form of system. They're genuine. If you took these laws to, say, South Africa or to Egypt, for example, they may not have had a problem because, again, elections are they're about the context. What is our context? If you read the Kriegler report that spoke about the post-election violence in Kenya, one of the things that Kriegler Commission spoke about was that the manual system should be progressively be replaced by an electronic system. So Kriegler himself mentioned this problem as having caused the PEV in 2007, 2008. So what we are saying as the Election Observation Group, one, that elections are contextual. If you took this out of Kenya, probably won't have this problem. But Kenya has had a different history, which we must be alive to. And I think part of our political divide is forgetting that history where we're coming from. And I want to take this time to remind our politicians that let us not go back to where we came from. And we are moving into an election time right now with emotions very high. Let us not bring the country to chaos. The second thing I want to say is that a consensus should be arrived at in terms of voter identification. Because if you look at last time in 2013, almost 3/4 of the EVIDs, that is the electronic voter identification devices, failed. And the results transmission system failed in most parts of the country. Now, Jubilee is saying that, look, we are foreseeing that failure. So can we now revert to a manual system? Even then, when they're saying, if you look at the provision, the changes that they're put in the law, they are saying they want a complementary system, which, again, the law does not define. So it's left for the IBC to decide which system, which backup system they want to use. So, again, from observer's point of view, we want whichever system they want to put in place, it must be arrived at a consensus. Let's call Jubilee and other stakeholders on the process that will give birth to this process, to whichever system that you want.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I want us to move on to the submissions that were given, but you mentioned something very important about the Kriegler report, that the manual system should be progressively replaced by an electronic system. Now, that was in the 2007 general election. We've had another election in between, and then 2017 elections. Is it a bit too far-fetched to now have the opposition expecting a fully electronic election?
I don't think the opposition is expecting a fully fledged system of voting. I think for the purposes of 2017, we shall use three electronic systems. One, in voter registration, that's the BVR. Number two, we shall use such system in voter identification, that is the AVID, and the results transmission. All those three elements. And in any case, you don't need, is it 3G to do results transmission? You don't need it. And there are options available for this country to avail. What happened in Uganda? Over 99% of the systems functioned. What happened in Ghana the other day? Over 95% of the gadgets functioned. So why are we in Kenya
calling ourselves the leaders of IT?
Exactly, wanting to fail? Because this is the question. There's a mischief that electronic system wants to arrest. And I think for me, not for me, but I think for the Election Observation Group, we don't want to say adopt this system or not. Our work at the Observer Group is that We want to monitor the process to be inclusive, to be transparent. And if you look at the Constitution in our Article 38, 2 and 3, it says that the technology that is adopted should be, among other things, transparent and accountable. So whichever system that the government puts in place should meet the threshold of accuracy, of simplicity, of transparency, accountability, and inclusivity.
Right.
Now, whichever system they adopt, as observation group, we shall be auditing it based on the threshold of the Constitution. And just a brief one. The Elections Act mandates the IBC to use technology. It does not tell us which one to use. Now, IBC has issued regulations on the use of technology, and they have said we shall use these 3 systems, which, again, Parliament adopted. But now, as you were saying, to move with only one side of the coalition to change these systems, they are not the only players. They aren't the only players. So therefore they need, and that's what Ithuru was doing. And you asked earlier on if that was exhausted. I think, first of all, it came at a time when most guys were home. So a number of submissions were well done, and as you can see, even if you listen to the submissions, over 90% of people who presented their views did not want a manual system.
Right.
They were very clear about it.
Right. That being said, that's the initial question I began with. Are you satisfied with the scope of public participation that was involved here?
Yes, and maybe before I answer that, I wanted to make a point that there are some Ivy League universities in the US, Harvard, Yale, MIT, who have PhD candidates in Kenya studying our ICT system, because they are saying Kenya is the Silicon Valley for Africa. That Kenya got very bright sharps on the space of ICT.
Right.
So it's actually very demeaning for the nation, Kenya, for the ICT cabinet secretary, who is supposed to make sure that Kenya becomes fully digital, on a public television with the international correspondents to say that we fear Al-Shabaab. As a nation, which is supposed to secure the lives and properties of all the nations, how do you succumb to Al-Shabaab and tell us that, wait a minute, we have to go manual because Al-Shabaab is coming to blow up our electronic system? Then the second point, part of the reason why we got into a crisis 2007, you would get that the person in charge of voting, say at Eastleigh, on his way to KCC to deliver results, it disappears somewhere. And it would take up to 5 days, while a guy from Mandera has already arrived in Nairobi. And yet he's carrying the results. Or you would get somebody from Nyando jumping into a matatu with the results, tightly tucked in a government envelope, waiting to get to Nairobi.
Right.
That's unacceptable in a modern age where you do M-Pesa, where you do very serious transactions online. So for me, really, it beats a reason of any rational human being as to whether or not the two systems are serious.
I mean, you can even get a degree online now.
Yeah, you get a degree online. So really, it makes sense. But looking at the quality of submissions, they were very solid, in as much as we did not have sufficient time. But there were so many people who were lined up. And even the chair of that committee, Mr. Awako, had even to limit the time, because some people wanted to speak for hours on end, and everybody was told that we're going to give you 10 minutes. Please put in your submission in a written form. So when you look at the quality of the submissions, was very solid. And this thing, you don't even need to have a PhD in engineering or in law or in, I don't know if there's a PhD in elections management. It's very basic that you need to be identified electronically. When you're going to cast your ballot and you are done, we need to do the tallying in an electronic manner and the transmission in an electronic manner. That one does not require any sophisticated skills at all.
Right.
You saw the National Chambers of Commerce and Industry. These are the people who are accused of having gone to bed with the Jubilee administration. But they came and they indicated we'd like an electronic system. And if you're looking for a plan B, which is complementary, why can't the plan B also be electronic?
Yes.
Yeah, then there's another organization, I think it's Kictanet, the organization of the ICT engineers in Kenya. They also said that you need a plan B, but the plan B and the plan C, all of them must be electronic. And when you look at the substance of the arguments, there's nothing wrong in having a manual system. But the problem is, all the leaders in Kenya know that there is a mistrust. And I would almost bet my head that a CORD would love the opportunity to have a manual system if they're able to manipulate it
Right.
to win the presidency. And Jubilee would like to have a manual system if they're able to manipulate it and win the presidency. But where CORD is seated today, they know that if somebody is going to manipulate the system, there's a very high chance that Jubilee stands an advantage at manipulating the system than CORD. And for me, I really think it's the levels of mistrust in Kenya, which are very high. And also the position made by the media owners of Kenya, by SK Macharia. You know, when he revealed that using their satellite technology, they know who won the elections in 2007. And the person who won the elections was not sworn in. You know, really, that's opening a Pandora's box.
Right.
And what our politicians need to understand, that in Kenya, politics or elections is a matter of life and death. That if we get it wrong, all of us in Kenya will be using peace latrines as refugees in Uganda, in Tanzania, in Rwanda, and Burundi. Because the nation can easily blow up. When you look at our nation today, we are sharply divided in the middle. Right now, if you go to Ishaweri and you ask the natives, why do you support the manual backup? They'll say we support it, but we have no reason. Because their leader has said. If you go to Bondo or Uasin Gishu and ask the same question, people will answer, not because they understand the philosophy behind it, but because their ethnic gods have said the same.
Right.
And you know, we don't want to get into a situation in August that after the election, you declare the results, and one party says, no, the results have been compromised. Which is why, when you go back to IBC, and you know, we must never get tired of saying this, that IBC must have predictable systems which are transparent, that Wanjiku can actually see, that Wanjiku can touch, so that at the end of the election, if somebody loses and he tells us go to the streets, we look at him in the eye, we say, Mr. XYZ, you're making a mistake. We know the system has been transparent, you've lost the election.
All right. Let me stop you there just before you continue. This must understand we have a caller who is calling in, Samuel from Nairobi. Good morning, Samuel. Thank you for calling in. What is your question or comment this morning?
Okay, thank you so much for the opportunity. I want to thank the panelists for the discussion. Hello?
Yes, go ahead.
I want to thank the panelists for the discussion, calling from Nairobi.
All right.
So what I'm saying, that it's not a question but a comment. In Kenya, right now, Kenyans on the ground, we need fairness. We even don't want to anything to do maybe with the systems or what have you. But if in the past, when we look at the history of elections, in the past, the manual system has failed tremendously. Now we cannot go back, resort again to the manual system which has failed. What we need to look is at a system which can bring fairness. And the biggest enemy to this, maybe to this progressive change, I think, is the Speaker of the National Assembly, Justice Justin Muturi. That guy, as even Ahmed Nasir Abdullahi in one of the recent commentaries, say that the guy is the biggest enemy. We've not seen sobriety in the National Assembly. What we need is fairness. We don't need dead voters. We need an audit of the voting list. We just need fairness outside there, or else this country might, and I fear, might resort to.
All right. Thank you very much. That is Samuel calling us from Nairobi. And also understand we have Edward calling in from Kisumu. Edward, good morning. What's your question or comment this morning?
My comment is about manual.
All right, go ahead.
About the manual.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I think it is a big joke because they should follow the footsteps of Matiang'i. If they can transfer the election and process it in all these remote places, they can use the satellite telephone to do that and tell you those things. But these people, they're just joking. They're just taking this country for granted, especially for those who are in the Senate, in the Parliament. They're all jokers. They have no interest for this country. They live for today's life.
All right. Thank you very much for your comment, Edward, there from Kisumu. I also understand we have a Victor from Nairobi. Good morning, Victor. What's your comment?
Yeah, for me, you know, from 12, we saw a president who is very frustrated. You know, in fact, he realized that the 2 million voters, the 2 million dead voters who woke up during on the material day voted, then went back to their graves, will not vote. And they hurriedly realized that the only thing they can do to manage that is to go back to manual voting, which we will not accept as Kenyans. I'm not a Luo. I don't want to say I'm a Luo or a Kikuyu. We will not accept dead voters to vote this time around. Let them rest in peace.
All right. Thank you very much for that comment, Victor, there from Nairobi. All right. So these are Kenyans calling in. And, you know, Dismas, you mentioned the level of mistrust is so high. And you can see that from the phone calls that we just got. People, you know, are saying, I'm not going to say which political party I'm affiliated to, but it's a big joke to use the manual system. So just for the purposes of trust, Marcus, is it that important that we use that electronic system just to keep Kenyans at ease?
I just want to reiterate what Samuel, our first caller, said, that they want a system that will ensure fairness in the process. And if majority of our players want an electronic system, so give them electronic system. Because, to be sincere with you, there is a narrative out there. Jubilee is saying the use of, and just before I say that, one thing that I need to underline, that every vote must count in the electoral process, every vote. So Jubilee is saying that if we go the electronic way, a number of voters will be turned away on the election day, and therefore failing to exercise their right. CORD is saying, and Jubilee is also saying that if we go the electronic way entirely, then CORD is going to manipulate the results. So in the event that, and CORD is saying Jubilee wants to rig the elections using the manual system. Now, in the event that this either Jubilee or CORD wins the presidency, how will people own the results? They will say, no, this is a flawed process, and therefore let's go on the streets and fight and regain our rights. So that narrative should really be out. Because we should stop that kind of discussion. Because you are telling Kenyans that whichever camp wins, that win is a flawed win.
And of course, it's become a political discussion other than, you know, a national discussion. Because like you say, you know, CORD is saying, Jubilee said, CORD said. But Dismas, our last caller, Victor from Nairobi, also had brought a very crucial point of the 2 million or so ghost voters that they do not want to come back to, you know, from the dead back in 2017. But even during the submissions before the Senate Legal Affairs Committee, there are some who said even that electronic system can be manipulated to allow those ghost voters to vote.
Well, the last call has indicated that the dead must rest in peace. And in my part of the world, where I come from, the dead must rest in peace. When you go to the submissions at the Supreme Court during the last election, there were many figures which were being given. One was 1.2 million, and another one was 2 million. That on the material day, people went to the polling stations, and they decided to vote only for their presidential candidates, but they did not care to vote for the other 5 positions. And in a normal election, you would expect that if you only vote for the president, or indeed any other candidate, you will have an equivalent number of spoiled ballots. So if Mr. Akum, say, decided to vote for Mr. Kenyatta or Mr. Raila or whoever it is, then you expect to see 5 spoiled ballots. Those were nowhere to be seen. This is the kind of mistrust that we need to eliminate from our electoral process. Today, if Mr. Odinga says the sky is blue, everybody from Jubilee would say, no, the sky cannot be blue because of the levels of mistrust. And it seems to me that in Kenya, the average man on the streets is wiser than the members of the Senate and the members of the National Assembly and the leadership of both Jubilee and CORD. Because the normal Kenya just wants to be sure that this election is free and fair, that the process is credible, that when you go and cast your ballot is going to count. Even the Constitution is very clear that to become president, you need 50% plus 1. So every Kenyan assumes the plus 1 is his ballot. So one wonders why the leadership in Kenya cannot ensure that the thing is credible. So that at the end of the day, because of the very high tensions, whoever who loses and wants to engage in mischief, we can tell him, wait a minute, we followed through the IBC system. The processes are very credible, so we cannot allow you to do this. Now, probability of rigging elections in a manual system is extremely high. Because what happens in a village which is heavily populated by one candidate and the other candidate doesn't have agents, all you need to do is to get a good ruler and a beak, and you keep on crossing and casting those ballots. It's very easy to do that. Probability of compromising an electronic system is more complicated. And again, those amendments require that any system which is going to be procured by IBC is going to be subject to stakeholders' audits. So the subject matter experts must be able to go through the entire system, audit it, and ensure that it's bulletproof. And in any event, if you're going to vote, say, at Nairobi Primary School, you'll actually know that Mr. Kenyatta has got this vote, Mr. say Odinga or Musalia Mudavadi has got this vote. So everybody will be able to have those votes. So really, I do not understand why our politicians are holding the country hostage. But again, that's being naive. The reason why the politicians are holding us hostage, they know that the promises they gave us during the last elections, they have not delivered on anything. They've actually been running around small circles.
Right.
So instead of allowing us to stay focused on auditing them and their performance, they want us to run outside the pitch. And before we know, it's August 18th, we are going to cast ballots without a proper audit. And there's another school of thought. There are a number of members of the National Assembly who know for a fact that they've done a shoddy job. They're even ashamed of themselves. They know for a fact they're not coming back to the National Assembly.
Right.
So they don't mind having another 6 months or another 1 year at the National Assembly or Senate enjoying taxpayers' resources. There's this conversation beginning to emerge that, in fact, these guys want to postpone the elections. And if you start joining the dots, the signs are beginning to emerge from the skies. Because number one, after they passed the legislation, instead of the National Assembly and the Senate, instead of the two speakers immediately sending the legislation, or rather the bill, to the president for assent, they dilly-dallied with the legislation for a long time. I think it was 4 weeks. And as soon as it got to State House, the president again took another long while before he could sign it into law. And when it was signed into law, we were told, wait a minute, we don't have a panelist. And the panelists cannot come into place before you get a new Chief Justice. So we had to wait for a few days before getting a Chief Justice. Now, the panelists are done with their job. They've done what people consider to be a fairly good job under the circumstances. And then all of a sudden, either somebody from Jubilee or CORD is casting aspersions on the integrity of the nominee for the chairmanship for IBC. So now you're beginning to wonder, if you're saying that there are question marks on the person and integrity of the nominee, why couldn't you take this information to the panelists? Why are you bringing it very late in the day? So really there is a mischief, either by design or default, by the ruling class in Kenya, whose sole interest is, their selfish interest, is just to keep on, stealing from Wanjiku. They don't want to be subject to a real election. And I think as citizens in Kenya, we must call them out and say, no, we cannot afford to be held hostage by this impunity, mediocrity, and corruption for a long time.
Right.
Because really, Michelle, look at it. What is so complicated about voting? I mean, we had a few doctors doing a complicated surgery at Kenyatta National Hospital.
With the conjoined twins.
Yeah. You have people inventing M-Pesa. You have Bill Gates coming to Kenya to study M-Pesa. I think wherever Bill Gates is, he's just looking at Kenyans and wondering whether or not we have our priorities in order. This thing is very basic. If you ask a Kenyan at the iHub to give you an application for this electoral process, they'll give you an application in 3 days.
Right.
This thing is so simple, it's very basic, but our politicians, I think their logic is just swapped up.
All right, I'm glad you mentioned that, because we do have a Tech Central segment right after this. We'll be speaking to a young Kenyan who has a very interesting technology that can actually open your gate back in your village from right here.
Yeah,
so things like that.
I mean, we have technologies in Kenya that you can turn on, and again, these are young guys who have probably not cast their ballots, they're under 18, who have software that you can use to do irrigation back in the village,
Right.
that you can turn on lights in your house, that you can control your fridge, you can even rearrange the contents of your fridge. And then you begin to wonder, what are we being told by Jubilee that we don't want to go electronic?
All right.
It's really saddening.
I want us to focus now on the outcome or the impact of whichever vote the Senate will have today. Now, a few things hold. The first one, Marcus, those submissions before the Senate Legal Affairs Committee were done in public. And like you mentioned, anybody who watched would know majority of the submissions were not in support of the manual system. And also IT experts mentioned it's very possible to even have 3 electronic backups to this election. Secondly, we've had the opposition already threaten mass action should these amendments hold. And thirdly, Jubilee has a majority in the Senate, considering the back and forth between Jubilee and Quad. So should the Senate vote today to uphold these controversial amendments, is the opposition going to sit down, or are we likely to see mass protests again?
I mean, first of all, I think the Senate acted in a very sober way during the last, when they were debating on these laws. And it is my prayer that yesterday, they retreated yesterday to discuss and and to draft a report, which will be tabled today. I hope they listened to the majority. And in a democracy like ours, majority usually gets their way. And majority of Kenyans wanted an electronic system, even the backups to be electronic. So in my view, I hope that's what they'll present today. So, I mean, the standing committee can present that report, but it may be adopted or not adopted by the House. So I pray they adopt it as such, to allow for electronic voting with again, an electronic backup system. In the event that they don't pass the recommendations, then there'll be what we call the mediation committee that will be created to again begin the conversations, trying to reach out to stakeholders again to find a middle ground. So I'm praying that at the worst case scenario, we have a mediation committee. Yeah, but in the event that, and I'm sure, and I can tell you, when the Coalition for Reforms and Democracy says they will go on the streets, they will go on the streets. Believe me. And this is very dangerous for this country. One, because imagine again we go for, and they say now that they'll be doing it daily.
Not every Monday.
Not every Monday. Yeah, it's going to be every single day you walk into chaos. We are moving, now we're about 7 months to an election. When you have this kind of turmoils towards an election, then the emotions are going to be very high. The processes are going to be very uncertain, and hence the result of that process. So they will go on the streets. Kenyans will get disillusioned. There'll be serious voter apathy and recipe for chaos.
And of course, retrogressing the gains already bed towards the electoral process.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, Dismas, what are your thoughts on either outcome?
Mr. Gidum Gai, or rather Amos Wako, sorry for that confusion, all of them have been two attorney generals. Wako is regarded to be an eminent scholar and highly regarded in society. And the fact that he's a chair of this committee inspires some level of confidence. And one hopes that he's going to come up with very solid recommendations. And obviously the prayer is that it's going to go into a mediation, that the National Assembly and the Senate will adopt divergent views so that we're able to now have them speak as a mediation committee. But still, whatever happens in the Senate today is actually immaterial. The buck really stops with Mr. Kenyatta, because the National Assembly has already taken a position. Even if the Senate comes with a divergent view and you're going for mediation, the people representing the National Assembly will be reading Mr. Kenyatta's body language. So if Mr. Kenyatta wants us to go electronic and ignore the manual backup and have a plan B, C, D, all the way to Z, which is electronic, that is up to him. He's the one who has the final word on this. And if he's unable to give instructions, because now it's very clear that the Speaker of the National Assembly and the Duale receive very firm instructions on how to make progress. If the two of them are not able to accept that, let everything be electronic, and in the unlikely event that you need a manual backup, this manual backup must be something which has been agreed upon by everybody. Because again, you never know what is likely to happen. There could be a flood. And you recall not long ago, there was a national blackout in Kenya because a monkey decided to trip on the power station. You never know these things. So you need a manual backup. But there must be guarantees that the electronic system has not been designed so that you activate the manual backup.
Right.
I think a manual backup is a very good proposition. But again, when you look at some scientists all over the world, they say the moment you start developing a backup in an electoral process, you're actually admitting that there's going to be failure within the first system. But because we know it's going to be life and death, we can have a manual backup, but we must agree, how are we going to resort to the manual backup? That what is going to
prompt us to actually opt for that.
Yeah.
So it's important to have that middle ground.
Yeah, but again, now making progress, you know, there's a lot of mischief occasioned by IBC officers, and after an election, they're not even fined. They don't take individual liability for that. You know, like for instance, if you're running, say, in Westlands, and the returning officer decides to declare the loser the winner, that stands. You have to go to court and have a petition, and it may take up to 1 year.
All right. Just before you continue, let's take one final call. I understand Byron from Rongai is on the line. Byron, thank you for calling. Good morning. What's your comment or question?
Morning.
Go ahead.
Right. I just want to contribute a few, yeah? About the manual voting system.
Right.
The fact that the Jubilee government is saying that we should go manual is a proof that they have failed. Yeah, it's a clear proof that they have failed because, first of all, when they entered into the government, into power, one of the things that they said is they really praised themselves as a digital government. You understand?
Right.
And that was, for a fact, gave them that 21st century kind of an image, you understand? A digital image into the world class rating, you understand?
Right.
So for them to tell us that the manual system, that we should go, when we are voting now, we should do the manual like as a backup, then it doesn't make sense at all. It doesn't give us an assurance as Kenyans that this is surely what Kenyans want, you understand? So in my opinion, if they were sincere and they were sure that this is what should keep this country moving forward, then they should have a clear backup system, which is digital, or like even a better system than what they were saying, because manual is going back to almost like a stone age.
Right, right.
You understand? Yeah, so it's really worrying. It's really, really worrying, and it's really a threat to this nation.
All right, Byron, many thanks for your comment. Very valid points there, of course, you bring on. We also have Sam from Nairobi. Sam, what's your comment this morning?
Yes, my comment is I'm very happy for the discussion that's going on.
Many
we
thanks.
saw it even the presentations to the Senate committee. It is very encouraging. Many Kenyans are for the good election. And when we are told the manual, election is manual, everything, my dear friend, is manual. Think of even the creation itself. God created man from dust. And it is only when he breathed into a man that he became a man. Look at ATM. You get to a machine, you want to withdraw 4,000. You apply your manual energy to feed the amount of money you want. Then the machine identifies you and it gives you, if it's 4,000, 4,000 becomes 4,000. That is manual translated to what you want. When you get to the bank, the man counter, you just put the money. If you want to count 4,000 and you have put 50,000 on top of the man, the counter, it will count for 4,000, and the 10,000 which is left on the top of the machine. Then you use your 4,000, and the rest you put it back to the safe.
Right.
It is exactly the same. When you want to vote electrically, it means you apply your own manual energy, and it is transformed to an identification. You are identified and you vote. If a polling station is, for example, Starehe, it's 4,000, and you have voted 4,000, and the registered are 50, the 4,000, the one that is accounted, and the 10,000 is left. It's not accounted for. So when the professor tells us, our AIG tells us it is manual, he is misleading us. Everything says, even flying, you engage an aircraft out by manual to out of fly,
Right.
and it can out to fly you from here to London. So you must apply manual energy, and it is transformed to what it comes. And what the end result is what we call it. So we want electronic voting. That's very simple.
Right. All right,
Yes.
Sam, many thanks for those comments, and a lot of anger also from Kenyans because they feel like they're being taken advantage of. But let's take some comments on Twitter as well. And we have at M Kenya here saying, I hate to be the prophet of doom, but I don't foresee Jubilee going down easy. Sorry to say that anarchy is inevitable. We also have at Kevin Ongo says, Jubilee campaigned on a digital movement platform. They should not apply double standards when it comes to elections. And lastly, at Hamudi Badala says IEBC cannot explain where the 2 million additional voters came from. The upcoming voter registration is another contentious issue. And of course, the politics. Jane says the politicians need to understand the politics is about life and death. We do not want to be refugees. And of course, that brings us to an end here on the State of the Nation discussion. We're out of time. We have been speaking to Marcus Agenga, who is the programs officer at the Elections Observation Group, ELOG, as well as political analyst Dismas Mokua. Many thanks, gentlemen, for joining us here in studio. And many thanks to you for your calls and comments and your feedback on our Twitter page as well. We take a